Welcome to the 2024 Nantucket Book Festival. I'm Ann Sullivan. I'm the Vice President of the Nantucket Book Foundation. This morning, I have the honor of interviewing Paul Harding. In 2010, Paul Harding won the Pulitzer for his first book, Tinkers.
I was going to say it's all been downhill from there, but, but I'm sitting in a throne now, so it can't be.
That's right. This book, This Other Eden, which we'll be discussing this morning, was nominated for the National Book Award, the Dublin Literary Award, and shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Not very far downhill. If you haven't read This Other Eden, you now have something to really look forward to. The book is inspired by an interracial community of people who, during the American Civil War, built their homes on a small island off the coast of Maine, Malaga Island. In 1912, they were forcibly removed. First, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
And thank you for writing this wonderful book. When and where did you know you were going to write this book?
Oh, I had finished writing my second book called Enon, which nobody but my mother has read or heard of. It suffered the fate of most second novels. I was sort of casting around, and I was working with some characters and some settings, actually, from the two previous books, just trying to, these very early stages where you're just trying to conjure a voice or an image or some sort of circumstance that was going to lay claim to your imagination. And I just, I was reading about labor unions after the Civil War, as one does, and it just sort of was one of those spontaneous sort of thoughts, questions. It arrived as a question, but the question was its own answer, which was there must have been racially integrated communities around the United States after the Civil War, before, whatever. And so it was as simple as I just Googled racially integrated after the Civil War. Yes, there wasn't nothing, and of course, lo and behold, just like page after page of sites or about these different communities came up, and one of the first ones to come up was Malaga Island, which was off the coast of southern Maine, as you said. And so I started reading about it. I just read there was a feature article about the story and about the people who had lived there in Down East magazine from 1980. And I just read this thing. It's maybe 12 pages long. And by the time I was done with the article, I knew, it had completely sort of gotten into my head, and I was just obsessed with, I don't know, there's something about, so many writers I know, islands are like catnip. Oh, set it on an island. Because then you can work with sort of legend, and you can work with myth, and you can, every island has its local lore and all this sort of stuff. And then writing about race in America and all that sort of stuff as well. I realized I could sort of have a kind of fictionally isolated community that would be a part of the greater country, but also kind of set aside a little bit so that there was room for the kind of literary resonances that I wanted to use, to create with it. I also, the moment I realized that I wanted to write a novel that was based on that kind of circumstance or that plot, I stopped doing it. I didn't do any research on Malaga Island, partially because I have no organic connection to that island. I don't know the descendants, the families, that sort of thing. And so anything kind of like there are historical novels, and then there are historical novels. And I wanted mine to just be, I wanted the latitude to be able to think about Shakespeare, say, and the Old Testament and all this sort of stuff. And I felt like that if I was trying to do that and at the same time trying to find, research who the actual people were, it would be doing a kind of violence sort of to their memory. So I just separated myself from that the hard history.
I'm relieved to hear you say that, because I always feel there's a conflict between history and historical fiction, and where do you draw the line? So,
yeah, and I think you know, it's sort of what lays claim to your imagination is almost an involuntary process. It's like you know, this whole idea for this book just sort of befell me, you know, the way that like a dream does. You don't choose what your dreams are going to be, right? So you know, I just found myself up at night thinking, what would that character do, and what would they think about? And so, but yeah, again, that idea about I mean, every sentence you have to be thinking about, you know, what is public domain, what is part of, you know, your prerogative as not only an artist, not only a writer, but particularly an American writer, you know, and thinking about American history and wanting to add to the repertoire of American literature, but without going too far, you know.
Yeah, the references in this book, biblical, Shakespearean, Moby Dick. So Moby Dick is ringing true here on Nantucket, of course. And the characters in this book are so brilliant. Maybe because I'm a grandmother, I feel that Esther is kind of the center of this community.
I agree.
Good. Right. Right. But there are so many brilliant, I guess, minor characters, although they don't seem minor. A few words about Zachary, hand to God, Proverbs.
So, yeah, one of the things about finding characters is they often just start off with a very, very simple, like a germ that you know. So with Esther, I thought she's something like a prophet, you know, and in the Old Testament, one of the hallmarks of being a prophet is not so much that you can somehow supernaturally predict the future, it's that you can see the present clearly. And that you speak truth to power. And if you can see the present clearly, it's not a mystery what the future holds. So there's something just very, very simple as that. And then just going with, you know, so the moment she sees these interlopers on the island, she knows we're gone. This is, you know. Zachary, hand to God, Proverbs. I was, you know, this is also as a writer, if you're going to spend 8 years or something with these characters,
right.
you want to give them and give yourself things that are interesting to you. That you're like, I'm happy that I just spent 8 hours sitting at a, you know, table trying to write this out rather than, you know, sort of self-flagellating, you know. So one of the things when I started thinking about him is I had just been doing book tour stuff up in Toronto, and I was at, I can't remember the name of the museum, that's a Museum of Ontario or something in Toronto, and there was an extraordinary collection of medieval ivory carvings there. These very, very, very intricate ivory carvings that were often in diptychs or triptychs, and they were very, very intricate, and they were all of biblical. And I just thought, oh, those are really cool. How can I work that into a book? It's as simple as that. It's not very, you know, erudite or anything like that. And I thought, you know what? I'll have a guy that carves that kind of stuff into a tree. And then this is where you say, this is my prerogative as a writer, you know, because I was like, what kind of wood would it be? How would the tree work? And it's just like, just have him do it.
Yeah.
Just have him do it, you know?
Well, and the most interesting thing is Zachary, hand to God, Proverbs actually lives most of the time inside that tree. And those carvings, the image, pretty amazing. But then, enter Matthew Diamond, a complicated character. As soon as Esther sees him, she knows this will not end well. Mm-hmm. And he comes to the island with seemingly the best of intentions to teach the children, and yet he introduces evil. And I think we could think of him as a white supremacist.
Among other things, hopefully. But yeah, I mean, I think that's another, he's another character where I thought I had to figure out, he does have to sort of precipitate the downfall of the community, but I wanted him to be a real human being. I didn't want him just to be a villain, you know, twirling his mustache, you know, because then it becomes, you know, if you take one false step with anything worth writing about, but particularly with kind of suite of subjects, you can lapse into propaganda very easily. It can just turn into sermonizing rather than something like presenting actual lives. So with him, there are two very, very simple sources that I sort of synthesized for him. One was thinking about Shakespeare and thinking about in particular, Macbeth, oddly enough. But one of the things about Macbeth is it's very simple. He knows, so Macbeth murders the king so he can get the crown. From the very second he decides he's going to murder the king, he knows this basically means I'm going straight to hell on a rocket sled, and so he does. And so I just thought, oh, he knows. Like one of the things that makes that character so interesting is that he knows and yet he persists, and that seems to be something that is nearly universally recognizable. We all know better than how we act. In certain ways, it's scalable. It's like, I shouldn't smoke this cigarette. I shouldn't have a dozen donuts with a half a gallon of milk. I shouldn't have left my brother to die in the ditch. Right? That's what it goes. Woo, that went south quickly. But So one of the things is he is racist. He understands he is prejudiced against black people, and so it was just as simple as having him be racist, but having him know it, be very acutely aware of it, and having him realize it was a blight on his soul. Yeah. And he also, I'm a theology nerd. I've spent the past 20 years reading, among other things, this Swiss theologian named Karl Barth, who, like all good Swiss Reformed Protestant theologians, has a church dogmatics that's 15,000 words. Right. And he was a founding member of a thing called the Confessing Church, which was in Germany during the Third Reich, during Hitler's rule, and they were some of the only people that actually actively helped Jews get out of Germany and actually actively resisted Hitler.
Wow.
And so years after admiring him with, unabashed, just like absolute admiration, his thought, his thinking, his politics, everything, I just happened to come across in a very, just obscure book of his letters, he just offhandedly said to whomever he was writing the letter, something about his son. He was talking about, he's like, I'm grateful that my son doesn't share the same awful prejudice that I have, which is the visceral repulsion I feel when I'm in the presence of a living Jew.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
And I was like, Carl, baby, you just broke my heart, man. But this is one of those things, like when you're a writer and you're trying to find a character who's like a real human being and not just, again, a paper doll that you're trotting around. It's the idea that he was anti-Semitic and he was one of the only people who helped. But neither of those things are so antithetical, but both are true and neither cancels the other. And so that's one of those things you try to find for characters who sort of, people can't just dismiss the character that way.
Yeah. I want to read a quick quote. The Booker Prize judges commented, "Though set in the past, it's impossible to ignore the novel's contemporary resonance, especially in its exploration of how those in power, convinced of their righteousness, abuse others whose identities and way of life don't conform to their own." Were you thinking about that much when you wrote? Probably not. You probably just were writing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was trying to, it seemed to, the reason I called This Other Eden, there's a number of kind of cascading or sort of nested reasons. But one of the things that I found is that actually when I got this idea to use that kind of master plot, I was actually thinking of, at the time, it was like Angela Merkel in Germany and the austerity and all the refugee problems they were having, and just like the seemingly sort of iron-fisted way, these kind of most disenfranchised people were just being further disenfranchised. And then, unfortunately, as the years go on, you think, oh, it's kind of like this terrible situation too, and it's kind of like that terrible. But then you're always looking for the subject in the story you're telling to become self-reinforcing, so that it's sort of like, wow, people are getting displaced here, people are getting displaced there, and then you think all the way back to, oh, Eden, You know, so there's something that's sort of mythopoetic and also historical about just people being kind of uprooted and being unhoused one way or another.
Yeah. I believe you said, without exaggeration, the book was written mostly on Post-it notes. Right? I love that. Yeah. Would you elaborate on your writing process?
Well, that's pretty much, yeah, very impressive stuff. Partly, I mean, it all goes back to when I was, well, it actually does go back to when I first became a parent. My wife and I first had the first of our two children, our two sons, and I had just gotten out of graduate school. I was teaching full-time. I was teaching freshman comp at Harvard, which they call expository writing, of course, and T.S. Eliot got a C- in it. I was teaching that full-time, and then I was teaching in the Harvard Extension School. I was teaching fiction classes at night, and I'd just become a parent. And that's when you realize, oh, I used to think I didn't have any time. So it sort of it sort of burns off any sort of precious, sort of like the muse didn't come today. It's just like, sit the down and just, So it was just a skill I developed I could sit down anywhere, and if I had 10 minutes, I would just sit down and just use a napkin, a receipt, and eventually Post-its. I live in a scurf of Is that you? Are you in there, Paul? My wife, I was like hide in my Post-its. But so by circumstance, but then also I found by disposition, I just work on one sentence at a time. I just try to make each sentence, and I wanted to kind of be a poet, couldn't do it, couldn't write music lyrics, but I found that I write kind of lyrical, often pastoral sort of stuff. So I think of like the writing as unlineated lyric poetry. So then that just lends itself to just having small pieces of paper, just trying to find just the right word for each moment as you go along.
Makes me think I could write.
You could. If I can do it, you too, Yeah, and then what's happened with each of the books, though, is that the book gets published, and I always find like a stash of like 800 Post-its. Like, oh, that was great. I would have loved if that was in the book. I said, lose, and where'd they go? So
it was probably 10 years between the publication of Enon and This Other Eden.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
10
much,
years.
Yeah, 10.
And yet, This Other Eden is 220 pages. It might have been 800 pages. This book is so full. But each word feels considered, and as a reader, I feel respected, I feel valued. It's made me curious as to what matters to you as a reader and how that affects your approach.
Yeah, that's great. A great question. And I'm not just saying that because that's what everybody says. Because it's true that I became a writer because I was a reader, and I just got to the point where I had to start talking back to my favorite books. And so if you look at This Other Eden and you think, geez, has he been reading Emerson and Emily Dickinson and Toni Morrison and Moses? You're dang right I have been, And so working with influences and that, but then also thinking my favorite books are books that respected me. They trust me as a reader. I don't feel coerced. I don't feel like my arm is not being twisted. The authors give you a rich enough world and trust you to go through it, and that's what I feel like, and that's how I write too. I don't think up lines for characters and then assign them. I try to write from the inside out, and to me it feels like a process of exploration and then revelation. You use the language itself to sort of feel around and find these moments that you just couldn't have thought up intellectually ahead of time. If I get up in the morning and I feel like I know what it is that I want to write, it's not even worth typing out. I use the language to try to find things that surprise me and delight me and are beautiful and sustaining, and then I try to write them in a way so that when the reader follows behind, what they get is a reproduction of my joy. And to me, one of the most powerful experiences I want to give my readers is that of recognition. You know those moments where you finish a book, you finish a chapter of a book, you finish a particular sentence, and you just stop and you say, that's absolutely true. And I've always known that was true, and I've never seen anybody put it into words. There's something very profound about that. You know, that record where you go, oh my God, why didn't I ever think of that?
Yeah. So you won the Pulitzer in 2010.
Thank you.
Tinkers, yeah. How difficult, I've heard a little of this, but how difficult was it to get Tinkers published?
Oh, it was very difficult. I mean, it took me, I think I was done with it. I sent it out, I queried agents and editors for 5 years before it was published. And I received everything from, like back then, it would be like Xerox pages, like askewed Xerox pages, like, dear Paul Harding.
Right, that's right.
Thank you. To like these indignant letters from prominent editors, you know who you are, you know, saying, "Oh my God, like this is if this book ever gets published, I'll know it's the end." You know, this is very strange sorts of. I remember one in particular said, you know, nobody, you know, the pace of life today is such that nobody wants to read a quiet, meditative, transcendentalist book. And I was like, the pace of life, you mean the one about which everybody ceaselessly complains?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So what you had to learn how to do is you had to learn how to reject the rejection letters. Just like what you have to say about my book, I don't recognize, I'm not, you know, I don't recognize anything.
Well, I hope they were suitably embarrassed after
Me too.
the Pulitzer. Yep.
No.
That's right.
No. It's, I mean, you do, without going into the weeds too much, there is a lot of legwork. You do have to spend a lot of time putting your manuscript in front of different people because you have to find not only somebody who loves the book, but somebody, like Erica Goldman, who ended up publishing Tinkers. When I first spoke with her on the phone, you know, and she said, I want to do Tinkers. And I said, can I pay you in installments? You know, like at that point, it was sort of like, and she said, just you hush up now for a minute, you know. And she said, I'm just going to tell you about the book I read, because if we're going to work together, we have to make sure first that I read the book that you wrote.
Right.
And I just was like, I love you, you know. It was really, really amazing. But it's funny. You have to kind of stick to your guns if you're an artist. Anybody who's creative, you know that. One of the things I say to my students all the time is, don't write your books for the people who won't like them. It seems so counterintuitive, but you know, don't pull any punches.
How and where were you when you learned the book Tinkers was nominated for a Pulitzer?
I didn't, well, to be nominated for a Pulitzer, your publisher just has to send 3 copies and a check that doesn't bounce to the Pulitzer people. So that's being nominated. Yeah. And then there are 3 finalists. The Pulitzers are done differently than any other book prize, mostly because they're still primarily journalism prizes. So with book prizes, you have the short list, and then the medium list, and then the long list, the wicked long list, the medium short list, whatever. And that's because it helps publicize the books, right? Because the longer that you keep doing that, you keep, you know, your book is getting noticed. With the Pulitzers, it's journalists, and so they're not hawking books. So I found out that I was nominated when I found out that I won, which I did by looking online. They don't call you. They don't tell you anything. They're very, 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 you know, very austere about it. So I was out teaching at the Iowa Writers Workshop. It was my first semester there. The director, Sam Chang, had hired me out of pity because I was, you know, paying my mortgage with my credit card and all this sort of stuff. And all the, you know, some very, very famous writers were my first students, and they're all like, what's this guy doing here, teaching us, you know? And then I won the Pulitzer, and I was like, that's what I'm doing. But no, no, they were really cool.
Awesome.
But I was going to teach that afternoon, and I just said, I thought, you know what? They're going to announce the Pulitzer right before I teach, so I'll just go online. I'll find out who it is, and we'll talk about it for 15 minutes, because everybody knows that like literary or any kind of award, but literary awards are very, you know, rowdy, partisan. It's a rowdy partisan sport, because half the time you think, oh, thank God she won. Art is safe for another year, or that, you know, that jerk won for that crap, you know, like it. So I thought it would just be fun, and so it was Olive Kittredge it was Elizabeth Strout had one. And so I was just hitting return. I was just like, Elizabeth Strout, Paul Harding. And I was, I thought it was one of my friends. I thought it was on. But one of the wonderful things just about that is that one of my students that semester was Justin Torres, who brought me a bottle of champagne. And he just said, "Own it, girlfriend." It was like, great.
Right.
And I was just like, "I love you, man." And then so this year when he and I were at the National Book Awards, we were both finalists and his book won. The next day, I got him a nice bottle of Moet.
Oh, nice.
It's so cool to be able to return the favor. So it was really, really wonderful.
Very nice. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your life as a professional musician. Most of you probably are aware that tomorrow afternoon at 4, Bill Janovitz will be speaking.
Is Bill out there?
Bill, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, there he is. I was dumbfounded when we knew that Bill had agreed to come to the festival this year, and I had sent you an invitation with my fingers crossed. But when I was reading the newspaper, and I was Googling you, I think, and I realized that you and Bill Janovitz's younger brother, Paul, started a band together at UMass, the band Coldwater Flat, if I'm not mistaken. But it was like a moment of grace. Okay, these two people are coming together, but you spent time as a professional musician after UMass.
Yeah, that's what I ended up going to graduate school because I was a drummer, and we were lucky enough to record a couple albums and do some touring, North America and Europe. And then when the band broke up, I was like 30 years old and hadn't done anything but either work in bookstores, which is awesome, but or temp. I was a janitor. Alphabetize your file. And so I just thought, I don't have a career. I don't know what to do. So I thought, I'll go get an MFA. I'll try writing, like anything to not have to get a regular job. Yeah. But it was funny because at the time it just seemed, my family was like, "Oh, what are you doing messing around being in a band and all this sort of stuff?" But I have to tell you that after all these years, what it took to actually be out on the road, and I know how to, when I had to go on book tours and started doing interviews again, it's like, I've done this already. I know how to kind of go from city to city, do the event, talk to people, do interviews, that sort of thing. And then, people like Bill and like Tanya Donnelly and Juliana Hatfield and people who were really gracious to us and let us go out. We spent most of our time kind of being the opening band. So that's another thing I'm very comfortable with, is I'm used to being the only thing in between you and the people you paid money to come to see. So I know how to play a quick set and get off, But the thing is those folks are still playing music. And that's been something that over all these years, it's like, they're real artists. It wasn't a hobby. These are real artists. And just that idea of this, watching all these other people model how you make a full life as an artist has been really something that sustained me,
Yeah, as I've read your work, it didn't come as a surprise to me at all, because I feel there's a whole cadence and lyricism to your writing, just the whole creative process. That part was not a surprise, but the connection at that point as we put the festival together was a
very
surprise.
Serendipitous, yeah.
I think I'm getting the message that we need to start thinking about your questions from the audience. Just one more quick thing. I believe I also read somewhere of the effect Marilyn Robinson had on you as a younger writer. Anyone else you just would jump to the Shakespeare.
Marilyn Robinson. She taught. The first time I ever took a creative writing class was up at Skidmore College. They have a summer writing thing every year, and the band was on what proved to be permanent hiatus. And so I went out and I took a 2-week class with her, and I read housekeeping before the class, and I thought, wow, that's really, really good. Extraordinary. And it was but I didn't really know much about her. And within like 10 minutes of her walking into the room and just starting to talk about the life of the mind and an artist and a writer, I just said, that's the life that I want for my own brain. Yeah. And so, and then I learned that she taught the University of Iowa, and I didn't know like the Iowa Writers Workshop. So I was like, oh, state school, I can get into the state school. And then she kind of wasn't there, like she won some big prize and sort of wasn't. So I sort of stalked her for a few years. I'd find out when she was doing a reading or teaching a class in Saratoga, and I'd drive from Boston all the way to Saratoga and contrive to like be walking past the classroom as it got out. And I'd be like, Marilyn, do you have time for a cup of coffee? And sometimes she'd say, no, I'm afraid not. And I just, go back to Boston. But we became friends subsequently. Nice. And her and Elizabeth McCracken was another. She was a teacher of mine with whom I'm still like dear friends, and they're also just continual inspirations.
So you've been out on the book festival circuit. In one interview I heard, I think it was Charleston, the very excellent interviewer, commented on the amount of profound thought in This Other Eden. You very quickly jumped in and said,
don't let that stop you from reading it.
That's right. That's right. Paul will be signing copies of the book on the lawn after we're finished, but now we do have time for some questions from the audience.
Hi.
Hi.
Have you considered or have you written any prose poems?
Have I written any prose poems? No, but I've at least sort of, with a little bit of magical thinking, I've convinced myself that what I do is just the opposite of, because the prose poem is a poem, right? And so I write, I think I just think of it as lyric prose. So it's more experiential, it's more impressionistic in certain ways. But following on the last thing we just talked about, one of the things I want to do is I want to write, so the book is 200 pages long. I want it to read like it's 800 pages deep, but I don't want it to be turgid and exhausting and, like you have to, I want it to be lucid and I want it to be accessible. And that idea of, this very democratic idea that was in a lot of the transcendentalist writings, and even in Shakespeare, if you believe it or not, and back to the Old Testament, which is being able to write clearly and lucidly about the most profound and irreducible, mysterious aspects of being a human. And so just that idea of, trying to, again, just write about profound things, but in a way that anybody who really, is reading in good faith, they will have complete access to it. There's nothing exclusive about what I try to do,
Thank you. First, thank you for writing the book. I have a comment and a question. I find it astounding with all the history classes I've taken, have never heard a word of what went on in the book. So that's sobering to know all there is out there. But question, has there ever been any sightings of Ethan? Thrilled that some of his artwork is still out there. But what happened? Do you have any history on that?
So Ethan was just somebody I made up. So he's just, he's just a fictional character.
But what is the artwork?
The artwork is, this is another one of those things where in my spare time, I'm kind of an art junkie. I love art, and I particularly love landscape painting and still lives. And so I just, I had him interact with or create paintings that I liked so I could describe them. You know, and his name is Ethan because there was a painter in the 19th century, a black guy I think he was based in Hartford, and his name was Charles Ethan Porter. And he did still lifes and landscapes, but a landscape that was very striking to me was a big painting he did of a meadow being mowed and the haystacks. And two of my characters were in the middle of hanging out in the haystacks, and I was like, oh, he's going to paint those. And I had that painting in mind. So
because the New York Times wrote an article about that, and they said for the 100th anniversary, they donated those paintings from the estate that he was on that got evicted, and they put the paintings.
Yeah, no, that's just all fiction. So, but that's one of the weird. That's what. Yeah. I think the Times is maybe. Well, there was an exhibit from Malaga Island up in Maine, but those paintings were just something I completely made up.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
But it's, you know, so it was just, but one of the things, if you haven't read the book, he's sort of one of the main characters, and he just disappears in the middle of the book and never returns. And so people say, are you going to write a sequel? And I say, no way. You know, because there are some very interesting arguments with editors about some of these moves that I made. You know, like, you can't just have, you know, the protagonist of the book just leave in the middle of the book. And I was like, I just did. He just, you know. And one of the things I said is, I want, you know, one of the ways that you get your book to feel like it's bigger than just what's in between the covers, to make it feel like it's the real world, is that I let things come into and go out of the book. They pass through the book as you're reading it. And one of the things I said to the editor, but you know, she's a big-time New York editor, and she was like, what the hell are you talking about? But I said, you, and this is probably true, there's probably not a person in this room who doesn't remember, you know, remember that kid Tommy? They lived like down on the corner. I remember whatever happened to them, and you're like, I don't know. Right? And people come in and out, and so that's the kind of verisimilitude that I put in the book. And when he left, it was just that the story was no longer, you know, the story was going back to the island. I kind of call it the Queen Lear phenomenon. You know, like, nobody says, where was Queen Lear? Those daughters would have been much better behaved if they had a mother there. And I'm sure Shakespeare would agree, right? But he's like, that's not today's play. Right. Right, you know? And so part of it is just like sticking to what your story is, you know? And I love actually having little mysteries like that, which I don't lord it over the reader. I don't know what happened to him either. So I wonder whatever happened to Ethan. And the couple of times I've thought, oh, what if he did this or that? There's something kind of more suggestive and kind of interesting and larger about him just being sort of he just is missing.
So one question I can't resist is, did you coordinate today your outfits? Do you do these kinds of plans in advance?
No, we both just have exquisite Saturday morning taste. Right? I would say.
I can see what's all of this contemporaneous thinking you have going on. But the real question was, do you read a lot of historical fiction yourself? It was sort of interesting what you said. I've always had that same problem with historical fiction. It's like, oh, I'd really like to read about what's going on at this time in life, only to find out that it was totally made up.
Yeah, I don't read a ton of it. I mean, I don't choose it according to whether it's historical. It's not a genre I'm particularly interested in. I don't read. I mean, it's not that I'm uninterested in it, but you know, I pick books, and you know, they kind of again claim my attention for different reasons. But you know, like Jane Ann Phillips, people who set fictional characters in non-fictional historical settings. I mean, one of the reasons why I like it, thinking about, or with this book anyways, that I liked it, is that it was very difficult. It was a challenge, you know, and you could hear, you knew, I think this is true of any book or work of art that's worth writing or producing or painting or composing, is it's not going to rub everybody's fur the right way. Because if you're writing about things that are substantive, they're not easy subjects. And so, you know, I would think, if I was trying to be an optimist, when this book comes out, not everybody is not everybody is going to hold a parade for me, you know. But you know, so but that's quality control. That's like you have to be respectful, you know. You should be respectful. You have to be thoughtful. You basically like I'll answer for every sentence in the book. You know, that's it. But that's why you like it. You do it because it's tough, not because it's easy. And grappling between, again, like what is public domain? What is all of our history? You know, and how are we allowed to or not allowed to go in or out of it? That sort of thing. And there are you know, writers generally are sort of feel like, well, it's kind of our job to kind of go over borders and imagine other lives and imagine. I mean, I had similar, you know, I had some editorial suggestions, not from the people who ended up publishing the book, but people would say, well, why don't you just make all the characters white? And I was like, well, that's worse erasure or appropriation. I mean, that would be just outrageous, you know? And you start realizing there's an ad absurdum to, you know, just like, well, then you want me to write a novel about a bunch of straight 56-year-old white guys playing golf? Like, I don't know, like, because then you'll take the piss out of me for, you know. So it's that, but so you have to really kind of earn your, you know, and grapple with that, like just how fiction works and how fiction, when it's synthesized with fact. This is what, you know, I think a lot of people just informally or casually, if you ask them, they would say that fact is a synonym for truth. And that's partially true, but fiction is, and one of the things that used to drive me crazy when I'd go to things like this, and the fiction writer up on the dais and at the throne would say, oh, I became a fiction writer because I'm a pathological liar, right? And I think, no, every single sentence I write of fiction has to be true. It's just not factual. And then the novel ends up becoming a synthesis of imagined and factual truth. And it creates something that no other art form can create, you know? That doesn't always make people feel reassured or happy, right? Because it can feel like you know, the materials that you're working with and shaping, you know, cross different boundaries and different borders. So, but yeah, I mean, I just do it because you can't make a false step, you know.
First, let me say I loved your book.
Thank you.
If you haven't read it, run out and read it.
Listen to her.
And no, we're not related. But I wanted to follow up on an earlier question about Matthew, and whether he was truly evil or whether he was just, all of us have biases. Some of them are known, others are latent, or whether, and I know he came to the island reluctantly, but then he really seemed to get into working with the kids. Yeah. I think he was put in a very tough spot. Back on the mainland.
Yeah, I think so. The question is whether or not he's evil. I mean, we could have a whole other a second hour about what evil and all this sort of stuff. You know, he's a, and this is not to be coy. I mean, this is true. He's both. You know, humans precipitate. You know, bring evil into the world through their acts, as it were. You know, evil is. I don't think of evil as this kind of autonomous metaphysical thing. That's like evil is human. Not all humans are evil, but all evil is human. You know, there are acts that we can, you know, consider evil. And so, and again, just so that you couldn't just reduce him to being like evil, you know, just like brand him with the E. He is the only person trying to help the islanders from the catastrophe that befalls them. And he has some very, very reprehensible ideas about race and about just these terrible racial prejudices. And again, some readers, you know, again, some readers don't like that because they want to be told what to think, or they want to be told like he's the evil one, they're the good one, and this is, you know. But to me, that's just trite. right? And so the idea of trusting the reader and just saying, here's a person who has at least two, but a number of like antithetical, polar opposite impulses. We all have our best impulses and we all have our worst impulses. And again, you just put them next to each other and you say to the reader, I trust you you can make what you want of this person, I hope that answers the question.
I think I would sum up Matthew Diamond as, well, in the beginning anyway, the road to hell was paved with good intentions.
Yeah, there's some of that.
He was a preacher, minister, and he had a home on the mainland that was within full sight of the island. So he went over in the months that you could actually go over in a boat to the island to try to educate this wild, uncivilized, in other people's eyes, group of people. And then I was going to say, thinking about the title in Eden, of course it starts off as Apple Island or the reference, but when you think of the Bible, and until they took a bite of the apple and the tree of knowledge, I think Esther, saw that, in that letting this outside person come in and start to educate and expose what they had never been exposed to, because so many had been born and never left the island, including herself. And, us civilized people think, oh my gosh, they were missing out and they had bed bugs and lice and gross and they're bringing over hygiene and that good stuff. However, she just knew that once that was introduced, like the tree of knowledge, they would no longer fully embrace this knowledge of just their life on the
there's a rupture. She knows that there's a rupture to the integrity of their community. And that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about the island as like Noah's Ark, but what if you couldn't get off the ark? And I also thought of it as like the island in the Tempest, and I thought of it as like the Pequod, which is the ship in Moby Dick, and all of those sorts of things. And this other Eden is it's from a Shakespeare play, Richard II, and John of Gaunt is sort of looking at what he thinks is England's ruin, and he says, this sceptered isle, this throne of kings, blah blah blah, this other Eden, sold for a tenant farm or something like that. And that's, Esther has this kind of line that sort of echoes that toward the end of the book, which is just, you're just destroying this community in our lives in the name of eugenics, but really just so you can like develop coastal tourism, But that's one of those things that sometimes I'm always looking for the books to be smarter than I am. And one of the things with this book is that only after it was published that I realized, the other Eden that's actually in the book is there's this sort of completely unconnected section of the book in which the young kid who's the painter and a girl who works as a housekeeper at the estate where he's painting, they have this little star-crossed, they're like Romeo and Juliet, they're very young, they have this little love affair that kind of happens in this Edenic sort of thing, and then they're cast out. And so I realized, there's all these nested instances of people coming together temporarily and finding a kind of peace, a kind of tranquility, a kind of mutual, like they're small, either two people or a smaller community or whatever, but held together by mutual loyalty and respect and love and all. And that they prove fleeting, they're breached, So.
Well, I really commend you for combining so many interesting aspects.
Thank you kindly. I appreciate that.
So I'm getting the nod that we have to cease our questions. So I'll just say one more time, thank you.
You're most welcome. Thank you. Great pleasure.